The people whose job it was to protect the public knew Damien Bendel was dangerous. They had known for years. His file said it. Previous officers had said it. The records going back to 2004 said it. 11 separate reports had assessed him as high risk. One officer who met him face to face described him as cold, calculated, and quite psychopathic. And then, 3 months before he killed 4 people, he looked at a woman fitting his electronic tag and told her exactly what he was going to do. He named the victims. He described the act. He said it without any change in his expression. She said nothing. The system did nothing. And on the night of the 18th of September 2021, in a quiet village on the outskirts of Sheffield, Damien Bendel walked through a house with a claw hammer and killed a pregnant woman, her 13-year-old son, her 11-year-old daughter, and an 11-year-old girl who had only stayed a second night because her mum said yes. Today we are covering the Killamarsh murders. Section 1. The victims. Who they were. On the evening of the 18th of September 2021, Terry Harris was at home on Chandos Crescent in Killamarsh, Derbyshire, a quiet village on the outskirts of Sheffield. She was 35 years old. Her son, John Paul Bennett, was 13. Her daughter, Lacey, was 11. Lacey's school friend, Connie Gent, also 11, was there for a sleepover. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday night. Earlier that day, Lacey and Connie had set up a cake sale outside the house to raise money for cancer research. They had spent the afternoon baking, selling and laughing. Connie had originally only been allowed to stay one night, but she had called her mum and asked to stay a second. Her mum said yes. That second night was the 18th of September. Terry was a mother who, by every account from those who knew her, made her children her entire world. Her own mother, Angela Smith, described her as completely dedicated to John Paul and Lacey. Jason Bennett, the father of John Paul and Lacey, described his daughter as outgoing, theatrical, obsessed with TikTok videos and performing. He said John was quiet and thoughtful, a caring young man who looked out for others. Connie's father, Charles Gent, told the court that his daughter loved to sing, act and read. She had just started secondary school weeks before she was killed. Terry was also pregnant. A post-mortem paternity test later confirmed that the baby she was carrying belonged to Damien Bendel, the man she was in a relationship with, the man she shared a home with, the man sleeping under the same roof as her children that night. By the time morning came, all 4 of them were dead. Pathologists confirmed that Terry, John Paul and Connie each died from head injuries. Lacey died from pressure to the neck. Each of them was killed in a different room of the house. The murder weapon was a claw hammer. Bendel had killed them one by one while they were spread across different rooms of a home they trusted was safe. The attack began shortly after 9:42 p.m, based on phone evidence recovered by investigators. At that point, the children were getting ready for bed. Bendel, at the same time, had been trying to contact his drug dealer to get cocaine. After he killed them, he took John Paul's Xbox games console, called a taxi, and went to Sheffield. He traded the Xbox for drugs. He then returned to the house, where the bodies of Terry, her children, and Connie were still where he had left them. Nobody reported anything wrong that night. Nobody called the police. No neighbours heard enough to raise the alarm. The house on Chandos Crescent sat silent. The following morning, at 7:26 a.m, a call came in to the police. It was Bendel's mother. She told them her son had stabbed himself. At 7:39 a.m, officers arrived at the property and found Bendel standing outside. He had 2 wounds on his chest and stomach, self-inflicted with a bread knife. He was calm. He told the officers straight away that he knew he was going to prison. When they asked him what he had done, he said, "I've murdered 4 people." He then told them where to find the bodies. 1 in the bathroom, 2 upstairs, 1 in another bedroom. Officers entered the house. One officer's voice, caught on body camera audio played later in court, broke as he said, "They're gone. They're gone. They're all gone." When Bendel was later interviewed at Ripley Police Station, he told detectives, "The whole house is covered in claret. I used the hammer." He also said, "Bet you don't usually get 4 murders in Killamarsh, do you?" "Well, 5, because my missus was having a baby." He said he had consumed 3 to 4 bags of cocaine and blacked out. He initially denied the murders entirely. On September 22, 2021, Bendel was charged with 4 counts of murder. He was later additionally charged with rape. At the vigil, held 2 days after the bodies were found, around 300 people gathered on the streets of Killamarsh. Family members stood among them. Angela Smith, Terry's mother and grandmother to John Paul and Lacey, spoke about the night she had to explain death to her grandchildren years before any of this. The night they told her they were scared of monsters. She had told them there was no such thing. How wrong I was, she said. 4 people went to sleep in that house on the night of the 18th of September. None of them made it to the next morning. The person who killed them was not a stranger who broke in. He was the man Terry had invited into her life, into her home, and into the lives of her children. What makes this case different from most murders is not just the scale of what Bendel did, it is how completely preventable it was. Because the people whose job it was to monitor Damien Bendel had been warned, and they did nothing. In the weeks and months before those 4 people were killed, Bendel had been moving through the probation system with a file that should have had every officer who opened it reaching for the phone. He had a criminal history stretching back to 2004. He had been flagged for violence against a former partner. He had made a direct, explicit threat to kill the very people he later murdered. And not one of those facts made it to the officer responsible for deciding whether he was safe to live in a house with children. Section 2. Bendel's background and criminal history. Damien Bendel was not someone who appeared out of nowhere. He had been known to the criminal justice system for nearly 2 decades before he picked up that hammer. His first recorded offences dated back to 2004, when he was a teenager. By the time he moved into Terry Harris's home on Chandos Crescent, he had accumulated convictions for robbery, attempted robbery, and grievous bodily harm. He had been supervised by probation services since 2011, 10 years before the murders. He was a former cage fighter. That is not a detail thrown in for colour. It matters because it speaks to someone who had trained his body to hurt people, who understood what violence felt like and what it could do. He was physically capable of the attacks he carried out, and the people in that house on the night of the 18th of September had no chance once he decided to move through it. Bendel also had a habit of presenting himself as more dangerous than even his record suggested. He repeatedly told people he was a high-ranking member of a white supremacist organisation called the Aryan Brotherhood. He described himself as a gangster. He had 2 Nazi-inspired tattoos. Probation records noted he was prone to telling grandiose stories, which is how his claims about the Aryan Brotherhood were eventually categorised, as exaggeration, as posturing, as someone trying to sound more significant than he was. Inspectors later found no evidence that probation officers ever checked with police to establish whether any of it was true. That decision, to dismiss what he said as bravado, would become a recurring theme in how the system dealt with him. People heard what Bendel told them and chose not to take it seriously. There was also the matter of a previous partner. Allegations of domestic abuse had been made against Bendel by a woman he had been with before Terry. That information existed in his records. It had been documented. It pointed directly to a pattern of violence within intimate relationships, which is exactly the kind of history that should have shaped every subsequent risk assessment he received. Inspectors later found that this information was missed by multiple officers across multiple years, not because it had been removed or hidden, but because nobody looked for it carefully enough. There were also concerns on record about inappropriate contact between Bendel and a young girl who had been in care. That too was documented. That too was not picked up and carried forward the way it should have been. The coroner later said that if that information had been properly recorded and flagged, it was inconceivable that Bendel would not have been considered a high risk to children. He was never assessed that way. Not once in the years leading up to September 2021. In May 2020, while living in Swindon, Bendel committed arson. He tried to steal a car and set it on fire. He was charged and eventually brought before Swindon Crown Court in June 2021. The probation officer tasked with preparing his pre-sentence report, the document that would help the judge decide what to do with him, conducted an interview with Bendel 2 days before sentencing. In that interview, Bendel told her he had found work as a builder. He told her he had a mass on the brain. Neither claim was verified. The officer later acknowledged that the report relied on Bendel's own self-reporting. That report was the 12th document prepared about Damien Bendel. The previous 11 had all assessed him as posing a high risk. The officer who wrote the 12th said she did not have time to read them. She told the inquest, with time constraints and workloads, it would be unlikely that people would have the capacity to read the reports. She was not justifying it, she said. She was explaining the reality of the situation she was working in. The 12th report concluded that Bendel posed a medium risk of serious harm to the public and a low risk to partners and children. On the back of that report, the judge handed Bendel a 24-month suspended sentence for the arson. He would not go to prison. Instead, a curfew was imposed. He was required to reside at an address of his choosing. The address he gave was Terry Harris's home on Chandos Crescent. Terry Harris had met Bendel online during the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020. She was a single mother raising 2 children. He was charming enough that she let him in. Her own mother, Angela Smith, later confirmed that Terry had no idea about the extent of Bendel's criminal history. The system that was supposed to manage him had never told her. Nobody knocked on her door. Nobody sat down with her and explained who was about to move into her home under the terms of a court order. Nobody asked how she felt about it or whether the children would be safe. The probation officer who recommended the curfew arrangement admitted at the inquest that she had not visited the property, had not spoken to Terry, and had not conducted any domestic abuse assessment. She had not checked whether children were living there. She had ticked a box on the pre-sentence report, confirming that safeguarding checks for John Paul and Lacey had been carried out. They had not been. The Chief Inspector of Probation, Justin Russell, later reviewed the case and said the handling of Damien Bendel had been of an unacceptable standard at every stage. He said the assessment that Bendel was suitable for a curfew at a family home was dangerous and entirely inappropriate, and that it was extraordinary that safeguarding checks were never completed. Bendel moved in. The curfew kept him at the address overnight. The system had placed a man with nearly 2 decades of violent offending, documented abuse of a former partner, and concerns about contact with a child in care, directly into a home with a woman and 2 children, without telling any of them who he was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And then, as part of the curfew conditions, he was fitted with an electronic tag. What he said to the officer during that fitting would be the clearest warning the system ever received, and it went completely unreported. Section 3 covers that moment in full. Section 3. The direct murder threat that was ignored. As part of his curfew conditions following the suspended sentence for arson, Damien Bendel was required to wear an electronic tag. The tag was fitted by an officer working for Electronic Monitoring Services, a service contracted by the Ministry of Justice through a company called Capita. The fitting was routine. Officers came to the address, attached the device, explained how it worked, and left. It happened every day across the country for thousands of offenders on curfew orders. During that fitting, Bendel looked at the officer and said, "If this relationship goes bad, I will murder my girlfriend and the children." He said it plainly, no raised voice, no visible agitation. The officer later described in a written statement how shocked she was by his facial expression when he said it, or rather, the absence of one. His face did not change at all, no flicker of emotion, no sign that he was joking, exaggerating, or testing a reaction. He said it the same way someone might mention the weather. The officer made a judgment call. She decided he was, in her words, just a bloke saying what came into his head. She did not record the comment. She did not report it to her supervisor. She did not pass it to the probation service. She did not flag it to police. She left the address and the comment went nowhere. 3 months later, Bendel murdered Terry Harris and 3 children with a claw hammer. At the inquest held at Chesterfield Coroner's Court in October 2023, Simon McEwen, a senior figure from Capita, gave evidence about what the officer should have done. He acknowledged that staff were primarily trained to pass on risks relating to their own safety rather than third-party risks. But he said that a comment of that severity should still have been raised. He told the court, "I don't believe she felt there was imminent danger, but that comment was so severe I would have hoped it would be raised." When pressed by Paul Clark, the advocate representing Jason Bennett and Kerry Shelton, the father of John Paul and Lacey and the mother of Connie, on whether there was an obligation to report the comment, McEwen confirmed that there was. The inquest also heard from the probation officer who had been assigned to manage Bendell's case at that point. Her name is Aisha Fatima. She had 5 months of experience in the criminal justice system when Bendell's file landed on her desk. She told the court that had she been informed of what Bendell said during the tag fitting, she would not have allowed him to remain living at Terry Harris's address. She was direct about it. She said, "I would have taken action. I wouldn't have allowed Bendell to reside at the address with Terry Harris and her children. I would have spoken to my senior probation officer." When asked why, she said, "Because it was a threat to kill them." She was never told, so she took no action. Fatima also told the inquest that she had not been given adequate training for the role she was placed in. Her training had been conducted largely online, over a couple of days on a Teams call. She described it as hard to concentrate and take everything in. She said she felt her training was inadequate. She had only read 2 of the 10 existing risk assessment reports on Bendell before taking over his supervision. She said she had not taken a deeper look at his history after being allocated the case. She would not have been given Bendell's file at all if he had been correctly assessed. His case, given the history in his records, should have been handled by an experienced officer. He was classified as medium risk, which is why he was assigned to someone with 5 months of experience. The senior coroner later confirmed that the misclassification had direct consequences for who managed him and how. The tag threat was not the only warning that failed to travel through the system. Bendell had also been admitting to his probation contacts that he was using cannabis and strong alcohol during the period of his supervision. He missed at least 5 appointments with a substance misuse worker. Under the rules governing his supervision, either of those things should have triggered a review of his risk level. Neither did. The coroner described the management failures around these missed appointments as the result of inadequate guidance from supervisors and a lack of oversight at every level. There was also the matter of what was already sitting in his file. The records contained information about domestic abuse allegations made by a former partner. They contained concerns about inappropriate contact with a young girl who had been in care. These were not rumours, they were documented. The coroner was explicit. If that information had been properly read, recorded and carried forward, it was inconceivable that Bendell would not have been treated as a high risk to children. He would not have been placed on a curfew. He almost certainly would have gone to prison for the arson instead. He did not go to prison. He went to Chandos Crescent. And the probation service, by the time of the inquest, had formally accepted 51 separate failings in how they managed him. Not oversights, not grey areas, failings. Accepted, on record, by the organisation responsible for keeping the public safe from people exactly like Damien Bendell. Chief Inspector of Probation Justin Russell reviewed the case and said the service's handling of Bendell was of an unacceptable standard at every stage. He said critical opportunities to correct errors had been missed, one after another, across multiple years and multiple officers. The tag officer heard a man describe, word for word, what he was going to do. She dismissed it. The system around her had been missing the same warning for years. And on the night of the 18th of September, Bendell did exactly what he had said he would. Understanding what happened inside that house that night, and what Bendell did in the hours after, requires going back to the moment the attacks began, because the sequence of events is more disturbing than most people realise. Section 4. The Night of the Murders. The Timeline. Earlier that day, Lacey Bennett and Connie Gent had been outside on the street running a cake sale. They had baked, set up a little stall, and spent the afternoon raising money for cancer research. 2 11-year-old girls doing something kind on a Saturday. That evening they were back inside, getting ready for bed. John Paul was in the house. Terry was there. Bendell was there too, moving around the same rooms, in the same home. Based on phone evidence recovered by investigators, the attacks began shortly after 9:42 p.m. on September 18, 2021. At that moment, as the children were preparing to go to sleep, Bendel was trying to reach his drug dealer. He was attempting to get cocaine. He could not get through. What happened next, and why it happened when it did, has never been fully explained. His defense team told the court his actions that night remained largely inexplicable and motiveless. He had maintained throughout the investigation that he had no memory of the attacks. What is known is what he did. He moved through the house with a claw hammer. He attacked each person in a different room. Terry Harris, John Paul Bennett, Connie Gent, and Lacey Bennett were each found in separate parts of the property when police arrived the following morning. The attacks were not over in seconds. Prosecutor Lewis Mabley KC told the court they were brutal, vicious, and cruel. The level of force used, according to the detective who led the investigation, was consistent with one intention only: to take the lives of everyone in that house. Pathologists who examined the bodies confirmed that Terry, John Paul, and Connie each died from head injuries caused by the hammer. Lacey died from pressure to the neck. Terry Harris was 35 years old and in the early stages of pregnancy when she was killed. The baby she was carrying was Bendel's child. A post-mortem paternity test confirmed it. She was approximately 10 weeks pregnant. Connie Gent was 11 years old. She had only been at the house because she had asked her mother for permission to extend her sleepover by one extra night. Her mother had agreed. That second night was the night Bendel killed her. After the four of them were dead, Bendel did not call for help. He did not call the police. He went to John Paul's bedroom and took his Xbox games console. He then ordered a taxi. He was driven to Sheffield, where he traded the Xbox for drugs. He bought what he went there to buy, and at some point he returned to the house on Chandos Crescent, back to the same rooms where Terry and the three children were still lying dead. When he was interviewed by detectives at Ripley Police Station the following day, Bendel described what he found when he came back. He said, "The whole house is covered in claret. I used the hammer. I didn't realise what I did until I walked into my room and saw my missus and my daughter." He told officers he had consumed 3 to 4 bags of cocaine and then blacked out. He said he could not account for what happened. The timeline makes that account difficult to accept at face value. He carried out 4 separate attacks in 4 separate rooms. He then located John Paul's Xbox, arranged a taxi, travelled to another city, completed a drug transaction, and returned home. Each of those steps required a level of functioning that contradicts the picture of someone who had no awareness of what was happening around him. He also told police something else during that interview. He said, "Bet you don't usually get 4 murders in Kilmarsh, do you?" "Well, 5, because my missus was having a baby." He said it calmly, the same flatness that the tag officer had noticed months earlier when he described what he would do if the relationship went bad was present again here. No distress, no horror at what he had done. A passing reference to the unborn child as though he was tallying a score. By the time officers entered the house on the morning of the 19th, the scene they found had been sitting undisturbed for hours. The bodies of Terry, John Paul, Lacey and Connie were in different rooms, exactly where they had fallen. A male officer's voice, recorded on body camera audio and later played in court, caught as he moved through the house. He said, "They're gone, they're gone, they're all gone." His voice broke on the last word. Detective Inspector Mark Shaw, who helped lead the investigation for Derbyshire Constabulary, spoke after sentencing about what the scene indicated. He said the level of force and violence used in the attacks showed they were carried out with one intention: to take the lives of those on the premises. He added that all 4 victims had come to trust Bendel by the nature of their relationship with Terry, and that he had taken the opportunity to shatter that trust completely. The force used, the hammer, the separate rooms, the fact that he moved between them, none of it pointed to someone who lost control in a single moment. It pointed to someone who went from person to person in a house where everyone trusted him. Bendel was standing outside the house at 7:39 a.m. when police arrived. He had 2 self-inflicted stab wounds on his chest and stomach from a bread knife. He told officers straight away that he knew he was going to prison. He said it the way someone says something they have already made peace with. Again. underscore underscore quote underscore 1 underscore underscore. What happened in the immediate hours after police arrived, the arrest, the interview, the charges, and how Bendel moved from denying murder to eventually pleading guilty to all of it is where the legal story of this case begins. Section 5. The arrest and investigation. The call that brought police to Chandos Crescent on the morning of September 19, 2021, did not come from a neighbour. It did not come from someone who had heard something in the night or noticed something wrong. It came from Bendel's own mother. She rang 999 and told them her son had stabbed himself. That was the reason officers were dispatched. They were going to a self-harm call, not a murder scene. Police from Derbyshire Constabulary received the call at 7:26 a.m. They arrived at the address 13 minutes later at 7:39 a.m. Bendel was standing outside the house when they got there. He had 2 wounds on his chest and stomach. He had put a bread knife 4 inches into his chest. The wounds were later described as superficial, meaning they were not life-threatening, but they were real and visible when officers approached him. He was calm. He did not appear distressed. He told the officers almost immediately that he knew he was going to go to prison. He used the word "again" at the end of that sentence. He had been to prison before, and he knew that was where this was heading. When officers asked him what he had done, he told them he had murdered 4 people. He then directed them to the bodies. He told them there was 1 in the bathroom, 2 upstairs, and 1 in another bedroom. He gave them the layout of the house as though he was giving directions. Officers entered the property. The body camera audio recorded what they found. A male officer's voice broke as he moved through the rooms. He said they were gone. He said it 3 times. Then he stopped. Bendel was arrested on suspicion of murder and taken to Ripley Police Station for interview. What he said in that interview sits at the centre of how investigators understood the case. He told detectives, "The whole house is covered in claret. I used the hammer." He said he had consumed 3 to 4 bags of cocaine that night and then blacked out. He claimed he did not realise what he had done until he walked into his bedroom and saw Terry and one of the children. He maintained that he had no memory of carrying out the attacks. He also told detectives, in that same interview, that he had gone to Sheffield after the killings. He confirmed he had taken John Paul's Xbox and exchanged it for drugs. He did not deny any of that. What he denied was the intent. He denied murder specifically, saying he had no memory of making any decision to kill anyone. On September 22, 2021, 4 days after the killings, Bendel was charged with 4 counts of murder. He was 31 years old at the time of the charges. In the weeks that followed, forensic teams worked through the property on Chandos Crescent. The investigation was conducted by Derbyshire Constabulary alongside the East Midlands Major Crime Unit, with a large number of specialist forensic staff. D.I. Shaw later described the circumstances his officers faced as some of the most harrowing they had encountered. He said that while officers and staff expect to deal with difficulties, no one should have to deal with such tragedy. In November 2021, Bendel was additionally charged with rape. The charge related to Lacey Bennett. The prosecution later told the court that Lacey was likely to have been raped at least twice by Bendel. The court heard that he raped her as she lay dying from the head wounds he had already inflicted on her. She was 11 years old. In the early stages of the legal proceedings, Bendel entered a plea of guilty to manslaughter for all 4 deaths. He denied murder. He also denied the rape charge. The legal position he was taking was that he had caused the deaths, but without the intent required for a murder conviction, a position consistent with his account of a cocaine blackout and no memory of the attacks. A trial date was set for March 2022. It was moved. It was rescheduled to May 2022. That date was also vacated. It was listed again for October 2022, and then again for November 2022. The case did not get to trial. On 21st December 2022, Bendel appeared at Derby Crown Court. He changed his pleas. He pleaded guilty to all 4 counts of murder. He also pleaded guilty to the rape of Lacey Bennett. He had held his not guilty position on both charges for over a year, before dropping it entirely on the day the case was finally listed for a plea and sentencing hearing. he did not give a reason for the change. His defence barrister, Vanessa Marshall KC, told the court that his actions that night remained largely inexplicable and motiveless, and that he had been happy about Terry's pregnancy, which would have been his first child. She acknowledged, on his behalf, that the seriousness of his offences was so exceptionally high that a whole life order was the appropriate sentence. The defence did not contest the sentence the prosecution was seeking. The Crown's barrister, Louis Mabley KC, set out to the court exactly what Bendel had done. He described brutal, vicious and cruel attacks on a defenceless woman and young children. He told the court that Lacey had been raped as she lay dying. He told them about the Xbox, the taxi, the drug deal in Sheffield. He put the full sequence of events in front of the judge so that nothing about what happened that night was left out of the sentencing record. For the families sitting in court that day, the guilty pleas brought the answer they had been waiting 15 months for. They did not have to sit through a trial. They did not have to watch Bendel's legal team challenge the evidence or cross-examine witnesses. He admitted everything in the end. But a guilty plea and a sentence are not the same as accountability from the system that put him there. That question, how Bendel was allowed to be in that house at all, would take another year to be formally examined. Section 6. The Sentencing. Derby Crown Court, December 21st, 2022. 15 months after the bodies of Terry Harris, John Paul Bennett, Lacey Bennett, and Connie Gent were found in a house on Chandos Crescent, Damien Bendel stood before High Court Judge Mr. Justice Sweeney and entered his guilty pleas to all 4 counts of murder and 1 count of rape. He was 32 years old. He kept his head bowed throughout the hearing. He did not look at the families. The people who had lost Terry, John Paul, Lacey and Connie were in that courtroom, and he did not once look any of them in the eye. The prosecutor, Louis Mabley KC, addressed the court first. He set out the facts of what Bendel had done in full. He told the judge that the attacks on Terry and the 3 children had been brutal, vicious, and cruel. He described a defenceless woman and 3 young children killed in separate rooms of the same house by the same man, using the same weapon. He told the court that Lacey had been raped as she lay dying from her head injuries, and that she was likely to have been attacked in that way at least twice. He told the court about the Xbox, about the taxi, about the drug deal in Sheffield, about Bendel returning to the house where the bodies still were. He told the court that Terry Harris had been in the early stages of pregnancy at the time of her death, carrying Bendel's child, confirmed by post-mortem paternity testing. Mabley KC made the Crown's position on sentencing clear. He said the seriousness of the offending was so exceptionally high that it fell into the category of cases that call for a whole life order rather than a minimum term. A whole life order is the most severe sentence available in the English legal system. It means no parole, no review date, no possibility of release. The person serving it dies in prison. Bendel's defence barrister, Vanessa Marshall KC, did not argue against it. She told the court that, on Bendel's behalf, it was accepted that the seriousness of his offences was so exceptionally high that a whole life order was what the court must impose. She described his actions that night as largely inexplicable and motiveless. She said he had maintained throughout that he had no memory of the attacks. She also told the court he had been happy about Terry's pregnancy, that the baby she was carrying would have been his first child. Then the family impact statements were read. Mr. Justice Sweeney described them as attesting in moving terms to each victim who had been so horrifically taken away, and to the utter devastation left behind. The families had written down what had been taken from them and submitted it to the court, so that it would be part of the permanent record of what Bendel had done. Angela Smith, Terry's mother, had already spoken publicly at the opening of the inquest about telling her grandchildren there was no such thing as monsters. How wrong I was, she had said. Her statement to the court carried the same weight, the grief of a woman who lost her daughter, her grandson, and her granddaughter in a single night, along with an unborn great-grandchild she never got to meet. Jason Bennett, the father of John Paul and Lacey, had said publicly that he trusted the authorities to have done their checks on Bendel. He had assumed that if someone was on probation, the system would have verified he was safe to be around his children. His impact statement sat inside that assumption. the understanding that he had believed the right people were doing their jobs, and that belief had cost him both of his children. Charles Gent, Connie's father, had described his daughter at the opening of the inquest as a girl who loved to sing, act, and read. She had just started secondary school. His statement to the court was the account of a man who sent his daughter to a sleepover and never saw her again. Kerry Shelton, Connie's mother, was represented throughout the legal proceedings. The decision to let Connie stay that second night, the ordinary, unremarkable decision any parent makes, was something she would carry for the rest of her life. When Mr. Justice Sweeney delivered his sentencing remarks, he addressed Bendel directly. He told him that he had a significant background of violent offending, including robbery, and that he had carried out brutal, vicious, and cruel attacks on a defenceless woman and 3 young children. He imposed a whole life order for each of the 4 murder counts. He imposed a further whole life order for the rape of Lacey Bennett. He said the facts of the offending had gone way beyond those envisaged by the court's sentencing guidelines. Outside court, Andrew Baxter from the Crown Prosecution Service said it was hard to put into words the scale of Bendel's barbaric and horrifying actions. DI Mark Shaw, who had led the investigation for Derbyshire Constabulary, spoke about what the case had required of his officers and staff. He said no one should have to deal with such tragedy. He said the families of each victim had endured more than 15 months of unimaginable distress and anxiety, and that at least the sentence meant Bendel would not be able to cause more harm. The families asked for privacy after the hearing to manage the aftermath and come to terms with what they had heard. Bendel was taken from the court to begin a sentence he will never finish. He will die in prison. That part of the case was now closed. Quote, _2___. But the question of how he got to that house in the first place, the probation failures, the missed warnings, the officer who heard him threaten to kill his girlfriend and children and said nothing. That question had not yet been formally answered. It would take another year, a full coroner's inquest, and the acceptance of 51 separate failings before anyone in an official capacity said out loud what the evidence had been pointing to all along. Section 7 covers the 51 probation failures and the coroner's verdict in full. Section 7. The 51 probation failures. In January 2023, 1 month after Bendel was sentenced, the Chief Inspector of Probation, Justin Russell, published the findings of an independent review into how the National Probation Service had managed Damien Bendel. The review had been ordered by the then Justice Secretary Dominic Raab after it emerged that Bendel had been on a suspended sentence and living under a curfew at Terry Harris's home at the time of the murders. The findings were damaging. Russell concluded that the probation service's handling of Bendel had been of an unacceptable standard at every stage. Not at one stage, not at a particular point where things went wrong, every stage. He said critical opportunities to correct errors had been missed repeatedly, across multiple years, across multiple officers, across multiple probation officers in different parts of the country. Later that year, in October 2023, a full inquest into the 4 deaths was held at Chesterfield Coroner's Court. It ran for 2 weeks. It heard from probation officers, managers, monitoring staff, and senior figures within the service. By the end of it, the probation service had formally accepted 51 separate failings in how Bendel had been supervised. That number, 51, was not contested. It was accepted on the record by the organisation responsible for managing him. Senior Coroner for Derby and Derbyshire, Peter Nieto, delivered his conclusions at the end of the inquest. He said that while Bendel bore primary responsibility for the brutal and savage murders, there were several very stark acts or omissions by both the probation service and individuals that had accumulatively contributed to the deaths. His formal conclusion for all 4 inquests was unlawful killing contributed to by acts or omissions by the designated state agency for offending management in the course of Damien Bendel's offender supervision and management. That is a coroner formally ruling that the way the state managed Damien Bendel contributed to the deaths of 4 people. The inquest examined the specific points where the system failed. The first and most fundamental was the pre-sentence report written ahead of Bendel's sentencing for arson at Swindon Crown Court in June 2021. That report was the 12th document prepared about him. The previous 11 had all assessed him as posing a high risk. The officer who wrote the 12th said she did not have time to read those 11 reports. She based her assessment largely on what Bendel told her about himself in a single interview 2 days before sentencing. He told her he had a job as a builder. He told her he had a mass on the brain. Neither claim was checked or verified. Her report concluded he was a medium risk to the public and a low risk to partners and children. The coroner described that report as wholly inadequate and misleading. He said it was part of a profoundly and seriously flawed process. The officer herself, giving evidence at the inquest, said that on reflection, Bendel should have been assessed as high risk. She said that if she had had more information, it would have been more helpful than relying on his own self-reporting. She was not justifying what she had done, she said. She was describing the conditions she had been working in. Those conditions were documented throughout the inquest. Probation officers from the Swindon office, which had handled Bendel in the years before he moved to Killamarsh, described their workloads as overwhelming. One officer said her caseload had been running at 179% of what it should have been. Another described an average of 140%. Staff said they were stressed, under-resourced, and in some cases had only been in their roles for months before being handed complex, high-risk cases. The officer who took over Bendel's supervision in June 2021, Aisha Fatima, had 5 months of experience when his file was given to her. She told the inquest she had only read 2 of the 10 previous risk assessments in his records. She said her training had been inadequate, conducted mostly online over a couple of days on a Teams call during the pandemic. She would not have been allocated Bendel's case at all under normal circumstances, given her inexperience, but he had been misclassified as medium risk rather than high risk, which meant the case was deemed suitable for a less experienced officer. The inquest also examined what happened, or rather what did not happen, when Bendel was fitted with his electronic tag. The coroner confirmed that the statement Bendel made during that fitting, in which he said he would murder his girlfriend and children if the relationship went bad, should very clearly have been passed on to the probation service. It was not. The officer who heard it dismissed it and did not record it. The coroner said that had it been reported, it was inconceivable that the curfew arrangement placing Bendel in the family home would have continued. On top of that, Bendel had admitted to probation contacts during his supervision that he was using cannabis and strong alcohol. He missed at least 5 appointments with a substance misuse worker. Both of those things should have triggered a review of his risk classification. Neither did. The coroner said this was the result of inadequate supervision from managers and a failure of oversight at multiple levels of the organisation. The records also contained information that was never properly followed up. Allegations of domestic abuse made by a former partner were documented, but not read and acted upon at key decision points. Concerns about inappropriate contact with a young girl in care were similarly recorded, but not carried forward. The coroner said a failure to demonstrate sufficient professional curiosity meant that information which should have been central to every risk assessment Bendel received was instead buried in files that nobody had time to read. The Chief Probation Officer for England and Wales, Kim Thorndon Edwards, told the inquest the service had been facing significant challenges during the period when Bendel was being managed. She said major changes had since been made to prevent a similar tragedy from happening again. The coroner acknowledged the pressures the service was under, including the impact of COVID-19 and a major structural reorganisation that had taken place in the months before the murders. But he was clear that those pressures did not explain the totality of what had gone wrong. He said, "They don't explain the totality of the acts or omissions or failures of the probation service's overview and supervision of Damien Bendel and the decisions made." The Probation Officers Union, NAPO, responded to the coroner's conclusions with a warning. Ian Lawrence, the General Secretary, said, "We will see something like this again, I'm afraid, and that's despite all the efforts being made." Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened after the inquest, to the house, to the families, and to Bendel himself inside prison, is where this case ends, but it does not end quietly. Section 8. Aftermath and current status. 2 days after the bodies were found on Chandos Crescent, around 300 people gathered in Killamarsh for a vigil. Family members stood among them. The village is small. People knew Terry. People knew the children. Flowers were laid. The community came out because there was nothing else to do, and standing together in the street felt like the only available response to something that had no adequate response. The house at 56 Chandos Crescent sat empty after the murders. Nobody moved in. Nobody was going to. For nearly 2 years it remained there, a physical presence on a residential street that the people living around it had to pass every day. Local residents, community members and the families of the victims were consulted by North East Derbyshire District Council about what should happen to it. The answer was consistent. They wanted it gone. On 21st of July 2023, the house was demolished. The property next door was demolished at the same time. The council had ordered it. The decision had been made partly to stop the address becoming a destination for people drawn to the location by morbid curiosity, what is sometimes called dark tourism. The physical structure where Terry, John Paul, Lacey and Connie were killed no longer exists. The land where it stood is empty. The families have continued to speak publicly about what they lost and what they believe needs to change. Jason Bennett, the father of John Paul and Lacey, said through his legal representative at the conclusion of the inquest that the hardest thing for him to accept was how the failings of the authorities had exposed his children to serious risk of harm. He said he had trusted that the necessary checks were being done. He had assumed that if someone was on probation, the system was working. His representative said Jason and the mother of Connie, Kerry Shelton, were adamant that decisive action needed to be taken, and that the findings of the inquest could not be pushed aside the way similar findings had been in the past. Too often, they said, reviews make recommendations that take years to implement. They did not want that to happen again. Angela Smith, Terry's mother, had already said publicly what the loss had cost her. She told the inquest she could not put into words the void it had left inside her. She said there were days she questioned the meaning of her existence. She had been a grandmother to John Paul and Lacey. She had been expecting a grandchild from Terry's pregnancy. All of it was gone in a single night. Charles Gent, Connie's father, described his daughter at the opening of the inquest as his wonderful girl. He said he would always miss her. Connie had just started secondary school. She had gone to a friend's house for a sleepover and asked to stay one extra night. That was the entirety of the decision that placed her in that house on the evening of the 18th of September. The coroner, Peter Nieto, issued a Prevention of Future Deaths report following the conclusion of the inquest. That report was directed at the probation service and set out the specific areas where changes were required to prevent a similar set of failures from occurring again. The probation service's legal representative, David Sandiford, said after the coroner's conclusions that the service recognised the changes made could never undo the terrible loss or assuage the grief of those whose lives would never be the same again. He confirmed that Bendel was rightly serving a whole life order. The Chief Probation Officer for England and Wales said significant challenges had faced the service at the time, and that major changes had since been implemented. The Probation Officers Union said they were not confident it was enough. Ian Lawrence, the General Secretary of NAPO, said another case like this would happen again despite all the efforts being made. That assessment from someone inside the system has not been publicly contradicted. Damien Bendel was sent to HMP Frankland, a maximum security prison in County Durham, to begin his whole life sentence. He did not stay out of the headlines. In May 2024, Bendel was working in a prison workshop at HMP Frankland when he approached a fellow inmate named Michael Mullaney. The two had a cordial relationship inside the prison. They sometimes played dominoes together. Without warning, Bendel picked up a claw hammer, the same type of weapon he had used to kill 4 people in Killamarsh, and struck Mullaney 4 times in the head. The first blow hit the back of Mullaney's head and dropped him unconscious to the floor. Bendel hit him 3 more times after he was already down. A prison officer who arrived at the scene believed Mullaney was dead. The officer drew his baton and sounded an alarm. Bendel immediately threw the hammer to one side and put his arms out. He was handcuffed. When officers asked him why he had attacked the man he sometimes played dominoes with, Bendel said, "I don't know." Michael Mullaney was taken to the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle. He spent 4 nights there being treated for 2 depressed skull fractures and bleeding on the brain. The injuries were described as potentially fatal. In a victim statement made 3 months after the attack, Mullaney said it had left him anxious, reluctant to leave his cell, and unable to sleep. Bendel's defence told the court he had planned the attack to engineer a move to the segregation unit because he was concerned his mental state was deteriorating. He had also been diagnosed with dementia. On 23rd of February 2026, Bendel appeared via video link from HMP Wakefield at Teesside Crown Court for sentencing. He was 36 years old. Judge Francis Laird KC handed him a further life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years for the attempted murder of Michael Mullaney. The judge noted the sentence was largely symbolic. Bendel is already serving a whole life order. He will never be released. The additional sentence simply placed the prison attack formally on his legal record alongside the murders and the rape. He watched the proceedings in a blue t-shirt with a shaved head. He said nothing. 4 people were killed on Chandos Crescent on the night of the 18th of September 2021 because a system built to manage dangerous people failed, repeatedly, to treat a dangerous man as what he was. Terry Harris was 35. John Paul Bennett was 13. Lacey Bennett was 11. Connie Gent was 11. None of them knew what was in Bendel's file. None of them had been told. The people whose job it was to know had either not read it, not acted on it, or not passed it on. Damien Bendel told an officer exactly what he was going to do, 3 months before he did it. That officer said nothing. He will die in prison. The 4 people he killed will not get older. Section 9. The Coroner's Verdict. The inquest into the deaths of Terry Harris, John Paul Bennett, Lacey Bennett and Connie Gent concluded at Chesterfield Coroner's Court in October 2023. It had run for 2 weeks. Senior Coroner for Derby and Derbyshire, Peter Nieto, had heard from probation officers, managers, monitoring staff, healthcare providers and senior figures within the National Probation Service. He had examined how Damien Bendel had been supervised going back years before September 2021. When it was over, he delivered his conclusions. He was clear about one thing from the start. Damien Bendel bore primary responsibility for the brutal and savage murders of 4 people. That was not in dispute. The question the inquest had been convened to answer was a different one: whether the way the state managed Bendel had contributed to the deaths of those 4 people. The answer, in the coroner's formal legal conclusion, was yes. His exact words: "My conclusion is, unlawful killing contributed to by acts or omissions by the designated state agency for offending management in the course of Damien Bendel's offender supervision and management." That conclusion applied to all 4 inquests: Terry Harris, John Paul Bennett, Lacey Bennett and Connie Gent. All 4 deaths were formally recorded as unlawfully caused, with the probation service's failures contributing to each of them. The final count of contributory acts and omissions, as recorded in the Prevention of Future Deaths report published by the coroner on November 29, 2023, was 57. Earlier reporting during the inquest had referenced 51, which was the number the probation service had formally accepted. The coroner's final report recorded 57 in total, covering both the probation service and Capita plc, the private company contracted by the Ministry of Justice to manage electronic monitoring. Both organisations were named. Both had contributed to the chain of failures. The Prevention of Future Deaths report was addressed to multiple bodies. It went to the National Probation Service. It went to Capita plc, specifically because one of their staff members had failed to report Bendel's direct threat to kill his girlfriend and children during the tag fitting. It also went to the Derbyshire Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust, because no record had been made of Bendel missing at least 4 alcohol and drug misuse appointments prior to the murders, despite those appointments being a condition of his suspended sentence order. 3 separate organisations, all 3 named in a document designed to prevent future deaths. The coroner's report was particularly pointed on one issue that went beyond the specifics of Bendel's case. Nieto said that following the inquest, he remained unsure that the probation service could clearly record information about dangerous offenders, and that he was not confident staff were adequately trained to deal with them. He was not just describing what had gone wrong in the past, he was describing a problem that was still present at the time he was writing. He put it plainly. The inquests had identified that domestic abuse and child safeguarding checks were either insufficient or wholly lacking at various stages of Damien Bendel's offender management. The current evidence, he wrote, was that domestic abuse and child safeguarding checks remained generally insufficient or were not being done, with consequent ongoing risks to children and women. He added that insufficient or absent safeguarding checks had been a recurring theme in HM Inspectorate of Probation reports and reviews for at least the last 5 years. That 5-year figure is important. The failures in the Bendel case were not a one-off collapse in an otherwise functioning system. They were consistent with a pattern the Inspectorate had been identifying and flagging year after year across multiple cases, long before Terry Harris and 3 children were killed on Chandos Crescent. The coroner also raised a specific concern about the software system used by probation officers to record and access offender information. The system, known as OASIS, had been flagged during the inquest as having misleading drop-down boxes and confusing formatting that made it difficult for practitioners to find and properly read critical risk information. Nieto said it remained unclear to him how an offender's high-risk status was prominently displayed on their record within the system. The practical consequence of that was visible in Bendel's case. Officers who opened his file did not always find the most important information quickly or clearly, and some of it was buried in sections that required active searching to locate. The Probation Service's legal representative, David Sandiford, responded after the coroner's conclusions. He said the service recognised that the changes made with a view to ensuring this did not happen again could never undo the terrible loss or assuage the grief of those whose lives would never be the same again. He confirmed Bendel was rightly serving a whole life order. He offered condolences. The Ministry of Justice confirmed that all 17 recommendations made in the earlier HM Inspectorate of Probation review, published in January 2023, had been accepted and were being reviewed and implemented. The Chief Probation Officer for England and Wales said significant challenges had been faced by the service and that major changes continued to be made. The family's legal representative told the court after the conclusions were delivered that Jason Bennett and Kerry Shelton, the parents of the Bennett children and Connie Gent respectively, believed that if appropriate measures had been taken, their children would still be alive. They said it was vital that the probation service took proper action following the coroner's Prevention of Future Deaths report, and that the findings could not be pushed aside. They pointed to a pattern they had seen in other cases: reviews that made recommendations that were accepted, and then years passing before anything meaningfully changed. One probation officer who had worked with Bendel had described him, in documentation, as cold and calculated and quite psychopathic. That description was in his file. It had been written down by someone who had direct contact with him. It did not change how he was classified. It did not change what he was allowed to do or where he was allowed to live. __quote _4__. The coroner closed the inquest and extended his condolences to the victims' families after what he called a difficult 2 weeks. The report was sent. The conclusions were published. The failures were on record. What happened to the families after all of that, and what Bendel has continued to do behind prison walls, is where this case leaves its final mark. Section 10 covers the aftermath in full. Section 10. Aftermath and current status. In the days after the bodies were found on Chandos Crescent, Killamarsh changed. The village is small. People knew Terry. People recognised the children. Within 48 hours of the discovery, around 300 people gathered in the street for a vigil. Family members stood among them. Flowers were laid at the end of the road. There was nothing else to do. The community came out because standing together was the only thing available to them in the face of something that had no adequate response. The house at 56 Chandos Crescent sat empty after the murders. Nobody moved in. For nearly 2 years, it remained on a residential street that local people had to walk past on ordinary days. The council consulted residents, community members, and the victims' families about what should happen to it. The answer was consistent across all of them. They wanted it demolished. On 21st July 2023, the property was knocked down. The house next door was demolished at the same time. North East Derbyshire District Council had ordered both. The decision was partly made to stop the address becoming a draw for people with a morbid interest in the location. The physical structure where 4 people were killed no longer stands. The plot is empty ground. The families have lived with the consequences of that night every day since September 2021. Angela Smith, Terry's mother, spoke at the opening of the inquest in October 2023. She described her daughter as completely dedicated to her children. She said she could not put into words the void the losses had left inside her. She said there were days she questioned the meaning of her existence. She had been a grandmother to John Paul and Lacey. She had been expecting a grandchild through Terry's pregnancy. She lost all of them in one night. Her daughter, her grandson, her granddaughter, and an unborn great-grandchild she never got to meet. Jason Bennett, the father of John Paul and Lacey, made his position clear through his legal representative at the conclusion of the inquest. He said he had trusted that the necessary checks had been done by the authorities. He had assumed that someone on probation meant someone being properly monitored. His children paid for that assumption with their lives. His representative said Jason and Kerry Shelton, Connie's mother, were adamant that decisive action needed to follow the coroner's findings. They had watched previous reviews produce recommendations that took years to be acted on. They did not want that to happen again. Charles Gent, Connie's father, described his daughter at the opening of the inquest as his wonderful girl. She had loved to sing, act and read. She had just started secondary school. She had gone to a friend's house for a sleepover, asked her mother for one extra night, and never came home. Charles Gent said he would always miss her. There is nothing more to add to that. Kerry Shelton, Connie's mother, had given permission for that second night. The ordinary, unremarkable act of a parent saying yes to a child asking to stay at a friend's house a little longer. She has had to carry that ever since, knowing that the system that was supposed to keep people like Bendel away from children had failed before she ever made that decision. The probation service, after accepting 51 formal failings at the inquest and facing a coroner's conclusion of unlawful killing contributed to by their acts and omissions, said the changes made could never undo the loss. The Probation Officers Union, NAPO, warned publicly that another case like this would happen again. Ian Lawrence, the General Secretary, said that despite all the efforts being made, he was afraid something similar was coming. That warning has not been retracted. The HM Inspectorate of Probation's report, published in January 2023, made 17 recommendations. The Ministry of Justice confirmed all 17 had been accepted. Whether and how quickly they are implemented is a separate question, and one the family's legal representatives said they were watching closely. Damien Bendel was sent to HMP Frankland, a maximum security prison in County Durham, following his sentencing in December 2022. He did not stay out of the news. In May 2024, Bendel was in a workshop at HMP Frankland when he approached another prisoner named Michael Mullaney. The two men had what people around them described as a reasonably normal prison relationship. They sometimes played dominoes together. Without any warning, Bendel picked up a claw hammer and hit Mullaney in the back of the head. The first blow knocked Mullaney unconscious before he reached the floor. Bendel hit him 3 more times after he was already down. A prison officer arrived and believed Mullaney was dead. The officer drew his baton and triggered an alarm. Bendel dropped the hammer immediately and raised his arms. He was handcuffed. When officers asked why he had attacked a man he played dominoes with, Bendel said, "I don't know." Michael Mullaney was taken by emergency services to the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle. He spent 4 nights there. He had 2 depressed skull fractures and bleeding on the brain. The injuries were described in court as potentially fatal. In a victim statement submitted 3 months after the attack, Mullaney said the assault had left him anxious, unwilling to leave his cell, and unable to sleep properly. Bendell's defence told the court he had planned the attack deliberately, not out of any grievance against Mullaney specifically, but to engineer a transfer to the segregation unit. He had been concerned about his own deteriorating mental state. He had also been diagnosed with dementia. On 23 February 2026, Bendell appeared via video link from HMP Wakefield at Teesside Crown Court. He was 36 years old. He sat in a blue t-shirt, shaved head, watching the proceedings on a screen. Judge Francis Laird, KC, sentenced him to a further life term with a minimum of 15 years for the attempted murder of Michael Mullaney. The judge was straightforward about what the sentence meant in practice. Bendell will never be released regardless. The additional life term simply placed the prison attack formally alongside the murders and the rape in his permanent legal record. He said nothing. Terry Harris was 35 years old. John Paul Bennett was 13. Lacey Bennett was 11. Connie Gent was 11. They were killed in a house they were supposed to be safe in by a man the system had been warned about and failed to stop. The warning had been explicit. The man who killed them had said out loud 3 months before he did it exactly what he was going to do. The officer who heard it said nothing. The file that could have stopped him being in that house was never properly read. The checks that might have saved those 4 lives were never done. Damien Bendell will die in prison. John Paul, Lacey, Connie and Terry will not get any older than they were on the night of the 18th of September 2021. That is the permanent reality of what the failures in this case produced. 4 people who had no idea what was in his file, and no one in the system who made sure they were protected from what it contained. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.